Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage podcast. I am your host, James Azar. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you're viewing us if you're watching this specific podcast on YouTube, or if you're listening online through your favorite podcast listening platform, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe and follow us on all social media. We're everywhere, even though we don't want to be, but that's the only way to get to you. So I've got an amazing show today. I mean, the man and the legend. Vladimir, and I'm gonna practice. I've practiced your name like 5 times, so don't butcher me for ruining it. And Vladimir is not a Russian agent, just so you guys know. So Vladimir Svidesskis. For someone who spent some time in Eastern Europe, I should be better at this. But I've been in the great red, white, and blue for way too long without going back there. So it is what it is. Chief Information Security Officer for Georgia Lottery. We have an awesome program, a great conversation, so make sure you stay with us. Before we do that though, if you're watching us on YouTube, we have our ceremonial espresso kickoff, which is an espresso Nicaragua roast, which is one of my favorite roasts. I've got a Costa Rican roast, but it's like the most expensive roast ever. It's like $2 a capsule.
Wow.
That's
expensive.
That is expensive, right? Can you imagine if Starbucks sold that? That'd be like $7 a shot. But cheers, Vladimir, to a successful podcast.
Cheers.
Do svidaniya.
Do zdrowie.
Do zdrowie. Do svidaniya is thank you.
Do svidaniya is goodbye. Goodbye until we meet again.
Until we meet again. Do svidaniya. We'll do that at the very end. I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, GetSmartEye. That's GetSmartEye, like your eye, EYE.com. It's a new security company that's focused on your privacy. How many of you guys have eyes around watching your screens, your phones, your tablets, no matter where you are? It can be your own office, an airport, a train station, a co-working space, and even a coffee shop, right? But there's some documents and some information that really needs to stay away from prying eyes. That's where GetSmartEye comes in. They're using the latest biometric technology to give you complete control over the documents you send and who sees them. Whether you're viewing them yourself or sending them for someone else to view them, the GetSmartEye technology ensures that whoever's seeing it is the right person. And should someone who shouldn't see it grab a look at it, it gets the document to disappear and won't reopen it until it verifies the identity of the person you sent it to. So to get more information, go to getsmarteye.com/James. Again, that's getsmarteye.com/James. Again, getsmarteye.com/James. So Vladimir, again, thanks for being on the show. I mean, I've known you for
a couple
years now, and we don't get to spend as much time as I'd like to. But you are the CISO for Georgia Lottery, the state lottery for state of Georgia, which is I think a very, very important role in probably one of the biggest financial kind of industries in the state and in the country in general, right? Because you guys run also the Powerball and all that locally as well, right?
Powerball and Mega Millions, right? Multi-state games.
Yes. And you guys are automating more and more of that today, like almost every single lottery game's on a vending machine somewhere.
Vending machine, and even now the mobile app.
Wow. There's a mobile app for lottery?
Mobile app, and you can purchase as long as you're in the state of Georgia.
With a debit card only?
With the registration and a Hope card, yes.
Oh, really? Very, very interesting. So before we get into that, though, my wife loves to play the lottery. So I'll tell you a story about that. But there was a rabbi out of New York who studied Torah. He was a rabbi.
Of course.
And his students asked him to go, Rabbi, how do you afford to live? And he goes, I play the lottery. And this rabbi was genuinely winning the lottery, a sum of money from the lottery every single time he played.
Wow.
Out of New York, right? The New York rabbis. So my wife is a big lottery player now. After hearing that story, she goes, maybe one day will be my day. Today could be the day.
Today could be the day, that's right.
Today could be the day.
And if she doesn't win, the students win. Because they get that scholarship money.
They get that scholarship money. That is absolutely true. People always forget that lottery has a good cause behind it.
Right.
But before we kind of get started going into that, if you don't mind sharing with some of our listeners and viewers how you got into cyber, because your background is absolutely amazing. You are a Marine.
Right. 10 years active duty from 84 to 94. And in the military, or in the Marine Corps, I started out in communications. I ended up teaching digital communications. And I transferred over to the intelligence side. And I started working with intelligence documents and intelligence hardware, or cryptographic hardware. So there, before we went logical, that was our data. Our data was actually hard copy paperwork, and storage was filing cabinets instead of servers. But we also had hardware that was locked up in safes or vaults. So there was a lot of security involved there. And widely across veterans, we are all ingrained in operations security.
Right.
So it's not because these young adults that start out in the military are 17, 18, 19, and 20, they go out in town and they party or they have a good time, and they may start leaking information. Mm-hmm. Kind of like forwarding emails all over the place that are unencrypted. And they start giving away information. So the leadership, military leadership, recognizes the youth and their first time out of the house, et cetera. They're on their own, independent. And they stress upon the young adults not to, loose lips sink ships.
Right.
So they stress upon them, don't talk about anything we're doing, even if we're going out to the field for 2 or 3 days on an operation or an exercise, because we practice the way we play. And if you leak about what you're doing as far as an exercise, then that kind of gives away tactics. So you want to do that. So that kind of gave me a background of intelligence and information security as far as securing information assets and not talking about certain things to certain people, depending on where they worked.
Right.
If they worked with me, then okay, we shared information. If they worked in other sectors, then we didn't share information, but we still were social. And after the military, I was teaching digital foreign communication systems to foreign militaries that were joining NATO. And I would teach their military frequency hopping communication systems. And after that, I joined an engineering firm. So I kind of transitioned from the military to a contractor for about 5 years and about 15 years with an engineering firm, and I started out as a PC tech. So as a PC tech, worked my way up to a regional IT manager. So I started looking at that and thinking, I like IT, I like the technical, I'm into information security from the older generation of it. So I put those two together, and at the Georgia Lottery, I was appointed the information security director. So I put the technical together with the abstract understanding of safeguarding operational security.
You've had I like to say, you have when you and I spoke, you always focus on the foundation of security. You're always talking about, I like to say, remembering the basics. Why is it, and too often young CISOs who enter the role almost always ignore the basics and try to kind of go and do all the big fancy stuff, but it's like building a house on sand. If you don't have a very good foundation, it's bound to crumble. What are some of the basics that you focus on, and why?
Some of the basics that I focus on are knowing what you have, because if you don't know what you have, you don't know what to protect.
Right.
So you got to know what you have, whether it's hardware or software, but you got to know what your assets are. And you can also start classifying them at the same time, but you got to know what they are. And then you got to know how they're set up or configured. You also got to make sure that they have their security patches applied appropriately, whether it's hardware or software. You have to conduct scans or assessments against them as well. Now with those are some good basic foundations. It's also the CISSP first 6.
Right.
Software and hardware inventory. You got to have your access control list to them. You got to have your patches and your configurations proper, and you got to conduct assessments. Now once you do those, that's mundane work. Sit there and do spreadsheets, or even if it's automated, but even if you have an automated hardware inventory tool that can see everything on the network, but you can potentially have things in storage that you're going to add to. So there's kind of some work you got to have with procurement on that. Once you have that mundane work done, people tend to move on to the more glamorous things. Like, look at these tools with these nice little views and dashboards and such, and start reporting those metrics and let everything else go on autopilot. You really have to revisit your asset inventory to make sure that the tools you're using, there's some kind of efficacy there that's valid, that's up to date and current. Make sure your inventories are current. Make sure the configurations are current, because your vulnerabilities are changing all the time. The threats are changing every day. We're finding new ones, like Bluekeep just came out again, right? So when we got rid of Petya a couple years ago, and then not Petya came, WannaCry was coming, you got Robinhood, you got so many of these vulnerabilities coming up, and if you're focusing so much on the monitoring for what's going on and looking at these nice dashboards and you're forgetting the basics, if something does occur, you want to make sure you have a solid foundation upon which to rebuild or to recover from. So the basics are pretty important in that area.
When you brought up some really classic vulnerabilities, and yesterday was the second Tuesday of the month, and Microsoft released, I think, 88 vulnerabilities, 21 of which they deemed to be critical. That kind of takes us to the challenge of when you're running the basics of patching and fixing, which, a lot of times isn't very easy, because sometimes it's not even reliant on you, because patching a unit could be something that entails having to go to your CTO or your CIO and their teams to get something patched, simply because it's a key component and you don't know how the operation of that specific program or app is going to be once it's getting patched. What are some ways that you use in terms of patching and kind of overcoming those basic challenges? Equifax was a classic example, and I don't want to chase that sunken ship, but it's the prime example that people always attribute to, is they go, oh, patching, Equifax. And Equifax wasn't just patching, but that was one of the reasons. But how do you start addressing the challenge of patching?
We started addressing the challenge of patching by looking at the criticality of the patches that are advertised. And I say that are advertised because you may have at your organization already some mitigating controls that are compensatory that can already mitigate that, or at least reduce that high risk down to a medium risk. So when we have these things that come out, these 0 days or these criticals that come out, or something like a Bluekeep comes out, the first thing we do is we look and see if there's any available mitigations already out there that have been discovered. And if there are, we start looking at that. But before we even do that, we look at the bulletins, the CVEs or the QIDs, if you got a Qualys type scanner or a Nessus type scanner. And we scan our entire enterprise to see what our exposure is to that vulnerability. See what our exposure is. And if our exposure is exactly like advertised, like it's right out there internet facing and it's right there, then we leave that criticality as critical or urgent. But sometimes we find that we're actually reducing that to a lower risk, and we're still addressing it accordingly, but we have to apply that risk towards our organizations. And then we have to deal with or not deal with, but work and collaborate with IT and IT security to ensure that they're adjusting their priorities appropriately, and that we still are looking towards that vested interest in the protected success of our organization. So we have a vested interest in the protected success of our organization. And with that goal in mind, together, that's how we work together to make sure that's our one goal.
When you talk about I guess you brought up a really, really great point right now, which is, the vested interest in an organization, in securing an organization, and securing information and data. And, one of the things I'm working on a few different kind of white paper and research papers, and I want to talk to you about both of those. One of which is, you being a Marine, veterans, I feel like, have a distinct advantage in security than someone who's college educated. And I talk from a perspective of mental and stamina, not from a professional standpoint. I feel like when you're in service, you come with a specific set of skills that you can only get by going through boot camp, by being shot at or being in, in an environment where someone's threatening your life per se. And I'm not saying every single soldier goes into the battlefield, but you learn a set of skills that help you in terms of stamina and mentality to be extremely successful. Do you notice, is there a difference in your opinion between someone who's a veteran who joins a cybersecurity team to someone who's college educated?
The difference is that I've been able to deduce is there's that repetitive regimentation of urgency. I think that's a good way to summarize it right there.
Right.
They have a regimentation, but they have that in college as well. But it's a repetitive regimentation of urgency all the time, and you're always being monitored for that. And with that progressive drive for organizational and mission success and mission goals being attained at very high percentages, you would think that'd be, wow, that's very stressful. Well, at the time, when you're knee deep in it, when you're in the mire, it didn't seem stressful because it was so repetitive. It was innate. It became who that individual was, character-wise. Whether they were with a combat unit or not, they still had those repetitive, regimented issues they had to deal with, and those missions and those goals that they had to meet. So coming out to the cyber side, you see this urgency of security, something that veterans already have an innate understanding of because of the way they were regimented or spoken with about operation security.
Right.
So you combine that repetitive regimentation with operation security when they glide in or blend in with the cybersecurity side. It's like, oh, this is old hat. But there are some relational issues there too. They have to. I think veterans have to find that balance in relationship, and that they're not in that repetitive regimentation anymore. So they can use those skill sets and should, but they have to temper those to the organization, to the society, and to the environment.
Because they're in a civilian organization,
right? Absolutely.
And I think that's a challenge. It's amazing for me because when I spent time in Israel, right, the first question you're asked in a job interview is what unit of the military you served in. That is a standard interview question. It is within the first 5 minutes of you sitting down for a job interview. Or if I called you and I said, hey, Vladimir, let's meet for coffee. And we would meet in a coffee shop and we would sit down. The first question, one of the first questions within the first 5 minutes, outside of where do you live, hot, cold day, traffic was good and bad, the basic stuff is, what you do in this military?
I bet you that drives some kind of intuition as to culture. Different units have different cultural drives.
Right. Different units mean different things. Oh, I was in, the infamous 8200 unit. Great. What'd you do? Right? What'd you do? Oh, I was, in Golani, which is a artillery unit. Huh, interesting. And when I moved there, it was funny because I was trying to explain to people what I did at the service, and they were like, I don't get it. And I'm like, okay. They're like, but you served in the U.S. Army? And I go, yeah. No. Huh. Okay, that's interesting. Why? Right? Right off the bat. But the culture there is also what unit you served in dictates your level of ability to understand and comprehend specific parts of a business. So if I'm an IT company and I want to hire someone to be my sales engineer, and I get someone from 8200 who's really skilled and has a very good personality, he's most likely going to excel in his role than someone who isn't, someone who came from a artillery unit or a combat unit.
And that's why I guess what they did in that unit makes a difference too, because you still have your communicators in an artillery unit.
Right.
Still have vehicle drivers, supply.
Right.
Okay.
What did you really do? And that culture to me, when we look at, Israel as a startup nation, I've been trying to attribute and study that. Having spent time there and spent time here, one of the things that always kind of I've trying to comprehend is how veterans here are treated when they leave service to how veterans there are treated. And mainly because almost everyone in Israel serves in the military, you can't really dictate it the same as you can in the US, right? Because here only 1% of the population really joins the service. So 99% are oblivious to the commitment, the sacrifice, the risks that are attributed with people who serve. And over there, everyone's aware of it. You know, my dad fought in the War of Yom Kippur. My grandpa was part of the Haganah in Israel, right? So, like, for them, fighting, all my uncles fought in wars. So, for them, it's, you know, they fought in wars. And so it comes from, you know someone who's been in battle, everyone knows someone who's lost someone in battle.
Right.
That's not the case here in the States.
Correct.
On Memorial Weekend here, we barbecue. Memorial Weekend in Israel, almost everything is shut down. The cemeteries are full. There's no, you don't hear comedy.
Right.
There's no movies on TV. There's only somber remembrance of those who've made the ultimate and paid the ultimate sacrifice.
Memorials, right.
Right. And I found that to be completely fascinating. And when I look at security here and how we're not taking more veterans into cybersecurity, how we're not really going to the service and creating programs and funding programs to take more of those veterans, even those that come from combat units. Because security isn't always about the keyboard.
Correct.
You said something, the very, very basics is operational security, which anyone who comes out of the service already has some level of operational security to fill in specific roles. Because to me, when I look at a security program, you look at it as not just being an isolated program. You look at having ambassadors in every business unit that help you build security in finance and operations and IT, you know, in customer support, in sales, in marketing. And that's where our veterans can really help solidify a program, because a very good combat person who has a great personality, who's a salesman in nature, can be great in teaching salespeople security and how to identify someone who's trying to gather operational security of an organization for social engineering purposes to launch an attack. He'd be able to do it better, I think, than someone who is just purely IT. Does that make sense?
It does. And even if they're not in cybersecurity at all, and you're going to have veterans in your organization, and they're going to understand that. So you can kind of leverage their understanding of operational security in security awareness training that you give to your independent departments and your business groups. So as you go and have these training sessions, you know, you split them up in various areas for each business group. You kind of want to leverage the understanding from any veterans that may be present and kind of have them identify with that.
I think that's one of those things where people underestimate the value our veterans can bring an organization.
I think one more additional thing as you speak on how veterans transitioning into the civilian community in cyber, I think there ought to be something in the military side, if not the private side, is to actually transition the veterans too, and get them out of that strict regimentation, that repetitive regimentation that, okay, that's it, everything comes off the table, we're going full bore, 24 hours a day, everybody's going to be here, we're ordering pizza, break out your cots because we're sleeping and living here. Found out that's a higher risk, but the probability may be medium, so we can put in some compensating controls and we'll put it behind a web app firewall or something. So instead of just spearheading and just marching in, they got to know, okay, are there other ways to do this and still run this organization, or blend in with the organizational goals instead of just stopping everything?
So what's really fascinating for me, what I've seen difference from CISOs that I've spoken with who've hired veterans, is during an event.
There's a difference there. Yeah.
There is a clear and absolute difference during an event. A veteran is more composed, mission focused. A college-educated person wants to go sit in a meeting and start to go through different aspects and consult different people, and you need both during an event.
Absolutely, because I think that even though you may have some experience from the military veterans or even the seasoned information security practitioners, the new grads or the college grads from a couple years prior, they can add to a lot of the technical skill and a lot of technical background that they've been, if you would, regimented through labs or their studies and research. So you add that to the exposure of operational security of veterans, and you combine that in, and that's how you have a diverse understanding and perception, and have dual focus on your goals.
So you talked about operationalizing security, and we just kind of talked about training security. How do you find the time as a CISO to really do the difference between operationalizing security and training? And training for cyber, how do you start addressing that?
You have to balance that very well, and I think the best way to do that is the internal staff needs to be trained in information security and kept up to date, because the landscape always changing, and that has to be intentional and strategic and placed on the calendar. You can't just, well, hey, we'll go to this event, go to that, put everything on the calendar as far as training. Because operations are always going to occur, and the dynamic changing landscape is going to change your calendar all the time. Put that training, whether it's 30 minutes or an hour or a half day or a day, put it on the calendar. So I strive to do that with my staff to make sure that they have that training on their calendar, and then we start putting organizational training on the calendar as well. Operations is going to change and impact those from time to time, but at least you have an intentional place marker for that on your calendar. So I think that's the balance there. Before, initially we're like, oh, training coming along, okay, let's go to that, but it wasn't intentionally and strategic and placed on calendars throughout the year.
It's when you talk about training, there's, I think, 2 levels of training, right? You got to train your Infosec cyber folks in your office and get their skills and hone in on their skills. You've got the awareness training that goes to the rest of the organization. What are some of the ways you manage the awareness training in your organization?
The awareness training, we're trying to at least semi-annually, where we're trying to work that up to quarterly, where we have open houses. And we'll just have 4 sessions in one day. And we'll have 2 morning sessions, 2 afternoon sessions. We'll pick a large conference room, and we'll actually work out of that conference room. And we'll be in different areas of the conference room, so anybody can walk up and ask us questions or convey any concerns they may have, personal or professional, when it comes to information security, securing information assets. And then we'll break, like at between 10 and 11, we'll have 2 30-minute sessions. Tips and tricks. So a general overview of InfoSec in 5 minutes, maybe another 5 to 10 minutes of tips and tricks, and maybe another 5 minutes of what is currently going on in the Southeast, in the country, in the world. And then we'll allow the last 5 or 10 minutes for questions. And we just have people rotate. It's totally voluntary. And just as an incentive, as we pick up gifts that many vendors give us, we collect up all those throughout the year, and we just give them out for all attendees. And so it's something to personalize it, and something to just sit there and have conversations with. And we'll do the same thing the morning and the afternoon. We'll have those sessions as well. We try to have them at least twice a year. We're good on having it twice a year now. We want to bump that up to quarterly. So that's one way of doing it. Another thing, when something does come out, like sextortion has been a big thing recently.
Right.
And we'll put out an information security bulletin. And we'll we'll go out to all the employees, information security bulletin. If an actual alert is out there, then we'll preface that with the word alert, information security.
You bring up a very valid point, which is, in today's world, when we talk about defense in depth in a cyber program and just layering your defense structure, the human element becomes the key aspect for hackers to try to penetrate an organization. And a lot of times, one of the very interesting things that I'm seeing, at least when I'm spending time in the dark web and I'm scrubbing, is business operation plans that are out there for sale.
Wow.
And that to me is absolutely fascinating, because if I have your M&Ps, your business operations, the way you process a payment, that lets me know as a hacker how I can really kind of fit into your organizational culture. The interesting part is when I look at that in forums, I'm noticing that a lot of that information is coming out through employees through social media. So, they'll target an employee on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, engage them through whatever aspect of it. How do you start addressing that? I mean, because that to me appears to be one of the bigger challenges, but it's also, you can't really train for it because we always talk about, the buzzword today is zero trust. But you can't have complete, you know what I mean?
That's great. That's right. You can't have zero trust. You got to have some kind of established trust. And I think what they do is sometimes they establish that trust and they forget to revalidate it. So it's like 6 months later down the line, they only needed that access for 2 weeks, and all of a sudden 6 months later they still have it, and they just build upon the access, and that exponentially increases throughout the whole organization. Now, as far as the social media, that's part of a training component that we put in as well, is no one's allowed to post anything on behalf of the organization. And we have an actual regulation that indicates so. So that's part of our training also.
I've seen CISOs now let employees know that you can't post where you work on Facebook as kind of a...
Or LinkedIn or other social media, right?
And I think LinkedIn's a bit more difficult because as a whole, LinkedIn, if you're in sales, LinkedIn or marketing, LinkedIn's a crucial part of... I think if we told no one to put their title on LinkedIn, LinkedIn would cease to exist.
Right. Everything would be done through personal messaging, and then they'd find that they'd use that as a vector too.
Correct.
Man in the middle or something.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, the challenge for all of us is that human element.
Well, we've heard so much people processing technology.
Right.
We got the technology. When we hear of threats, people go out and they start writing checks and they start spending on this, spending on that. Processes, okay, we need some kind of document that says who we are, the authority we have to do what, and to what extent we provide this for the organization. Now, when we talk about people, which is first, people, process, and technologies, do we just mean we need to be staffed and they need to be trained, have skill sets? The soft skills of understanding operational security, that takes a lot. That's where your larger investment of actual effort and time goes in, because you have to identify the threats to the individual and their culture and their understanding. And that takes a lot of time and effort.
It does.
You have to care. Now, once you do that, you'll see that that'll propagate out. All you got to do is hit 1 or 2 people within a group of 10. That can propagate out if they work together in that collective. And you keep adding the training on a quarterly basis, sending out bulletins, sending out phishing campaigns, and you keep reviewing things and keep connecting with people and having those relationships.
Do you believe in the if you fail a phishing test, I'll punish you that some organizations are running now?
I saw that come up, I think it was on Krebs, was it? It was on Krebs recently, and they said if it should be a fireable offense. Well, it depends. Was it very well crafted, and was it their first time? Because people are people. Now, you have to offer them the training opportunity. And they train, and you test again, and they hit again. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry, I knew it. As soon as I clicked that, I knew it. I got it the first time, and as soon as I clicked, I knew it. I'm calling you right now because I'm telling you I clicked on it, and I'm sorry. They're starting to get it. But if it's just click, fail the training, click, fail it, and they don't care, they're being dismissive about it, I don't know if it should be a fireable offense, maybe some kind of probationary thing that gets into HR and personnel stuff. But we need to understand what that individual's perspective is when it comes to operational security, when it comes to securing information assets. Do they understand what the impact could potentially be of that mistake?
So that kind of brings me to communication. And during an event and an incident in an organization, typically communication becomes the barrier in succeeding in handling an event. We saw that with, and I don't want to beat on a dead horse, but Equifax tends to be the one of the most prominent examples of failure in communication, from the executive leadership down to the security team, and then out to the general public, to regulators, to law enforcement and others. What are ways you really what should organizations really do to really communicate properly during an event?
I think that they should prepare. I think we should always prepare first. And I think communication is one of those things that should be listed in your IRP is who's declaring, and then the communication plan and the communication tree. So who is in the position to declare an event, who is in charge of communications, and how frequent that communication should be. And if that's a guideline, because at some times you know what, instead of every half day, we need every hour. It depends on the specific incident or event. But also that call tree has to be up to date and current. And it shouldn't be just one deep, but two deep for every job responsibility within that IRP or that incident response plan. And the communication is very important. And I think once you detect, they go detect, contain. Well, I say detect, contain. And there's this one key aspect of communication, and that is declaring. So if you detect and contain, where are you declaring? Because in that declaration, you're also making a communication to the senior executives and or the CEO as necessary. That way, they know something's up. They know the immediacy of it, whether the criticality is a high or just this is an FYI, I just want to let you know this is going on, or if this is really urgent and I needed you to know.
What's really interesting is internal communication during an event in an organization tends to vary. And what I mean is, I see it, I mean, we're obviously in the cyber community, so it's always funny. You'll see the CISO and you'll meet some VPs or SVPs or directors, and they'll tell you something completely different from what someone else is saying because everyone has a different perspective to it. How does that get discerned? I mean, how do you really kind of pause all of that as a CISO and just get your team into understanding that what you say has a significant impact, not only internally, but also externally?
So we have to have these tabletop exercises, whether they're just walkthroughs or actual scenario-driven exercises. And that plan has to be complete where the communications is actually listed in there as to the types of communications and between which parties. For instance, if you have something that's reportable, then you're going to have to deal with, or your plan should identify something with legal and HR and PR or corporate affairs. So that legal can get with HR and discuss, well, this is what we want to tell all the internal employees. Do say this, don't say this, don't answer this, as far as how the internal employees should conduct themselves when it pertains to this issue that is starting to come up. And the same thing for PR. And if anything does get out to the news medias or something else, that they have to control that as well. So our legal, our GC is part of that with our corporate affairs.
I kind of want to shift to technology for a little bit.
Okay.
We talked people. We talked a little bit about process. But we get to technology, right? And you said we've got technology. You're right. We have so much technology. The buzzwords, I mean, my LinkedIn feed is crazy. My Twitter feed's worse. Some of the Facebook groups and LinkedIn groups I'm a part of, I mean, you hear a lot of different noise when it comes to technology. How do you as a CISO just manage to dissect that noise and really find what you need?
I look at those basics again. And sometimes with these new threats coming out with AI and IoT, you start looking at those things like, okay, do we have anything that can cover all that and monitor for those things, while at the same time we're revalidating or validating our basics. So we revalidate our basics, but we also have something in place that can watch the entire enterprise architecture from a high level, from an AI point of view, or for any IoT type related issues. So that's the technology in there.
Are you, when you see all these different buzzwords that are being thrown out there, and like you said, AI, machine learning, I think IoT is a whole separate, kind of vector and landscape of its own that I don't think enough people have wrapped their heads around the real damage that can be done through IoT and the sheer number of IoT devices that exist today and get sold every single day that are used every single
Right.
day. I mean, I was in a company's office. I was meeting with a CEO of a company who had an Amazon Echo on his desk. I was like, huh.
So is it total voice recognition from the CEO only, or from anybody?
I didn't ask the question. I just looked at it and said, wow. And I was there with a CISO and looked at the CISO and I go, I understand your challenge, because there it is right there. When your CEO has an Amazon Echo on his desk in his office where he conducts all his meetings, all his phone calls.
Well, have you heard of some people, like their phones will automatically start mapping them somewhere because of the voice recognition, or some keyword was spoken, or Siri will pop up and start responding and so on. It's like, I didn't do any of this. So I think with the advancements with IoT and AI and additional technologies and all the vendor protections, I think if you look at it, we might be chasing a lot more things than fixing the root cause of the exposure. We have a lot of things going out there,
Right.
A lot of IoT, everything from your water meter being checked, refrigerators IoT, cars, you have GPSs in fleet vehicles, and we're fixing one element here, one element here. It's like, wait, what's the root cause? The root cause can be there's a session involved. And like with the phones we were talking, or with the Echo, that session, what is it interfacing or integrating with? Is that protected? And is it explicit, or is it just open? It's like having an open firewall, but you don't have an open firewall. You let certain things go out and certain things come in. Some things only one direction, some things bi-directional. And with the new next-gen firewalls, which one thing I do like is you can actually identify the user, the time frame, the specific app, the transport mechanism, the port, whether it's two-way, one-way, and you can make those you can make those communication sessions explicit to the intended purpose. Now, that's not going to eliminate the risk, but I submit that it can reduce the risk no matter what IoT is out there it's communicating with.
You can't have 100% security.
That's correct.
And that goes back to the people part of it. People are people. It's funny, someone said with autonomous cars, you'll have no accidents. And I go, I beg to differ. I go, if you have human override, you'll still have accidents. I go, in technology, still made by humans.
Whether it's an accident or intentional.
Right.
So I think that's interesting with the sessions, because, on your smartphones, do you log out of every single app before you close it? Most people don't do that. Well, there's an issue of convenience too.
Right.
That becomes inconvenience. So like, oh my goodness, I just want to log on to here. I got to log back on, or put in my code, or MFA. Here comes MFA on this with a PIN code. It's like just for one app to use it for a half a minute, then I got to log out. People don't want to do that. So there should be maybe some coding about timeout thresholds. If there's no swipe in 5 minutes is a lot of clock time. How long can you look at one page on your mobile phone for 5 clock minutes and need it to be open for 5 clock minutes? Then shouldn't they have a timeout threshold? And that timeout threshold kind of locks it out. Still makes it available next time you swipe on it. That's a coding issue. I'm not in software development. That's kind of an idea that goes in that area of session protection, because they want access to your microphone, your camera, your contacts, your email, your photos, your database, all that information. Why? Why do I need that just to be on an auction, web app or mobile app?
So that's really funny. In the on the other podcast I do called Goodbye Privacy, I did a whole study of the terms and conditions on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Hotmail, Gmail. And I specifically looked at the mobile app part of it. And here's the interesting part. Everyone gives them access to contacts because that's how they match you up with your friends. And then it explicitly says that even though You may have never signed up for any of our services. Someone could have given us your contact information, which allows us to monitor your activity so that we can create an environment for you to communicate with your friend. So let's say I turn off all my social media tomorrow, but you're on Facebook and you've got my phone number in your phone and you've given Facebook that access. Facebook can now collect data on me without my consent.
Consent by proxy?
Consent by proxy.
That's crazy.
That is a fact. And the people who are collecting it isn't really Facebook. So Facebook outsources that to data brokers, who, by the way, make $200 billion a year. What a thriving industry.
Shouldn't there be some legislation against data collection by proxy?
So there isn't.
Data?
There isn't. Vermont is the only state. Vermont. Like all 75 people that live in Vermont.
Right.
Right? They have a legislation that the original format of the legislation was very good. Then lobbying came in. It got watered down to where if you collect any data through a third party, meaning you're a data broker, you have to register with the Vermont Secretary of State. So you got to pay the Vermont Secretary of State filing fee and register there. So out of 4,000 companies, 121 of them registered. That list is readily available to see. And you have to allow people, you don't have to opt out. You don't have to provide an opt-out. And most of these companies actually force you to pay them money to opt out of their database. So they collect your data for free without your consent. If you want to get them to delete your data, you have to pay them a fee. And it can be $3, $10, $20.
Wow. So where's privacy?
It doesn't exist. That's why my other podcast is called Goodbye Privacy, because it really doesn't exist anymore. And that brought me up to a fear level, a new vector. We saw that the Russians used a very, very similar vector with Cambridge Analytica in the 2016 presidential election. Cambridge Analytica was a data broker.
Right.
They called themselves a data analytics firm, but technically they're a data broker. They rebranded, now they're a new company, they have a different name,
Of course.
right? But they're still the same. They still do the same exact thing. So these data brokers collect data and they sell it to anyone. No vetting at all, none. So let's say we don't make privacy legislation, but let's say we make specific data required as a whole to be vetted. Who's buying it? Who are the people that are buying this data? What are they buying it for? Let's start with the root cause of not only collecting data, but who are we selling that data to?
What's the end use?
Right, and that end vector of it is what I feel is the biggest challenge when it comes to people.
Identity.
Identity, and how easy would it be to create a secondary form of identity?
Absolutely. With no privacy, identity is not going to be as validated.
Right. And that's a whole new threat vector when it comes to people. And if I'm a hacking group, I can go and I can buy a bunch of data.
In someone else's name.
In someone else's name. I can take that data and analyze it. Let's say I want to go to Silicon Valley and I want to buy the data of everyone who lives within 100 miles of San Francisco and Palo Alto. Think of what I could do with that data.
You'd probably be busy for the rest of your life with that.
Right.
Especially if you spoofed someone else's identity.
Uh-huh.
Which you might be able to do if you're also involved in one of those, the 23andMe, is that what it is? With all the
DNA?
Right. And I talked to some people that did that, and they wanted to know. And they said, well, they believe the security is secure enough at those organizations. I said, I trust them with the data. So it's not a matter of the organization. I'm sure they have well intentions, but what if they get hacked? Then someone can really be you.
Well, they were already hacked, right? I mean, I think it was at MyHeritage that was breached, 90 some odd million people's DNA results.
Right, absolutely. So now people can actually validate a false identity. They can create a false identity or duplicate one and validate it, or seemingly validate it.
If you think of data mining,
Identity mining.
and you look at MyHeritage, Equifax,
There we go.
the readily available social media data that's available through data brokers, which you don't need to breach, you can go out and buy. Even though the most recent breaches that we've noticed in the news over the last month or two have all been supply chain third party.
Mm-hmm. I think when you bring all that back, though, to an organization, and I think one of the tough roads to climb will be for a CISO or information security executive is to now share that information with the senior executive leaders and let them know that it's not a matter of if it's available on the internet or not, or on the dark web, because most of our information probably is, but can it be attributable to our neglect for due diligence? Because you can't just say, well, we're not going to do it because that stuff's out there on the internet anyway. It's like, so if someone is harmed and they can attribute it to your organization, then there may be some legal things occurring there. And then there's reputational issues as well.
Yeah, among others. I mean, I always feel like, people are so, I always hear whenever I go to conferences, people talking about data security, protecting your data. I go, no one's really talking about how hackers make a living. They don't make a living by taking your data and selling it on the dark web.
No.
They do it by financial fraud. And it's $5, $10, $20, $30,000 at a beat. And you know why they do it like that? Because they know the FBI isn't going to even lift a finger to investigate it. Right? If I steal $15 million, the FBI is going to be on my
different story. Right.
Different story. If I steal $25,000, you've got insurance. Insurance is going to pay you for it. Right? $75,000, $100,000. Insurance is going to pay you for it.
Absolutely.
And I move on.
What's it going to cost to recoup that? A little bit too much, so let it fly. Write it off.
Right. And no one's really talking. No one has that real. I have yet to hear, and I don't know, maybe you have. I have yet to hear anyone really address that specific. Everyone keeps talking about data security. No one's talking about financial security. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the message that needs to get to the board. That's the message that needs to get to the executive leadership. With all this data on everyone being out there and so readily available, how likely are we to have HR and payroll fraud? How likely are we to have vendor fraud? How likely are, and no one talks about it, and no one's tracking those numbers because no one's really reporting it. That to me, that's what keeps me up at night. And not someone accessing my database and taking it.
And add that to the reputational loss and losing 1/4 of earnings.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. That to me is the scary part. I think Frank Abagnale Jr., I was at a conference in Alabama in April, and Frank Abagnale Jr. is the FBI agent who the story, the movie, Catch Me If You Can, the book and the movie, is based out of. And he did the original check fraud. You can kind of consider him the original cyber criminal because he did it all over the world. He was global. He was in Sweden and France and Belgium and the Netherlands. I mean, the US, Canada, Mexico. Hearing his story and then watching the movie. If you watch the movie first, you don't hear his story, you don't read his book, you realize how much the movie leaves out. So the movie made it all glamour. But you realize the extent to where he went and what he did, which wasn't all very, very bad. His crime spree was about as long as, Jesus Christ's, entire ministry, about 3 or 4 years, right? It wasn't 10 years, it wasn't 15 years. It was very short-lived, but he was very successful at doing so. But he talks about the IRS now goes through $6 billion a year worth of tax fraud.
Wow. That's quite a jump.
$6 billion. We're not talking about
currently. That'll probably hockey stick up. Probably just go straight up from there.
So that has nothing to do with your data, because that data is readily available. Mm-hmm. The data is everywhere out there. Where you work, how much you can potentially earn, that data is all readily available. So copying it and filing a fake tax return on your behalf has just become so much easier. But no one's really talking about it.
Smaller amounts. Low and slow.
Right, but that's not sexy. That's not a headline.
Right.
Right, we talk about data security, but we're completely forgetting about financial security. And I feel like that's where the CISO conversation needs to go. I don't know. You're a CISO. You tell me. I think that's a message that
exactly where it needs to go.
I think that's
total impact to the organization.
Right.
Not just partial impact or certain impact, but the total impact, the financial impact, the reputational impact, the near future impact financially, and then you can have any kind of legal action as well.
Yeah. When we talk about IoT and kind of the buzzword for IoT today, when we started our episode today, we talked about the apps, the machines. Those are all you could consider them to be IoT devices, and in some cases, even though they might be hardwired. But what are some of the challenges and what are some of the items on your checklist when you're looking at IoT devices?
Looking at any IoT devices, always want to check out that session, that security, and that interleaving, the interleaving of that application or particular application supporting any IoT with other applications on the same device. Like I previously mentioned, people are just installing things and they have access to everything that's on that particular device. So I think shutting down the application that supports any device or any hardware just to an explicit activity for that device, for that purpose, for that particular transport, in that method, for that time frame. And I think that's going to be maybe difficult to code or develop because of the overhead that may cause. You might have an app that's 3 times the size just to do that. So something has to be configured, maybe even on a device that works with that particular software. So both of those in the platform it's on that actually has an explicit session for that purpose, for that device. But I think that may take a bit.
So the debate on IoT is, should it be a buyer's responsibility or a manufacturer's responsibility when it comes to security?
Buyer beware. Buyer beware.
So you wouldn't even trust the manufacturer's security on an IoT device?
No.
Why?
Validate it. Test it for your organization. Because when someone makes a stove for your house, they make a stove for all houses. This is supposed to work in all houses. Well, you have to validate it. Maybe it won't work in your house. Maybe you got electricity and not gas and vice versa. Maybe it's too wide, too narrow. Maybe it's too deep. It runs in with the other drawers coming out. So yes, it'll still work, but is it made for all houses or not? Same thing with an IoT. Well, let's check it in our organization. Let's do a demo or a beta and test it and see how it works. And see what the feel is for the users. Because the user, it's all about organization. If we're buying devices, it's supposed to be for the betterment of the organization, more efficient, more cost efficient, and more operationally efficient. And if it's not, then we have to go somewhere else or provide that feedback and see if they can adjust.
I was at a SunTrust event in Augusta, and Mike Roth, the CISO for SunTrust, was there. And they had the deputy director of the NSA and the lead investigator for the GBI cyber unit that's in Augusta at the Georgia Cyber Center. I asked him a question. Said, most infrastructure devices today that come into the country or even go into an organization are made in China. We already questioned the backdoor capabilities that this technology could possess. How do you overcome that? Because buying something that's made in Europe or the US is going to cost you 20 to 40% more of what you would buy in China. So China's already coming within or under budget for you. How do you start to address that specific challenge?
That's a tough area, especially with the chips,
right,
especially with recording or any CNC. So right off the bat, you have to be prepared for some kind of monitoring of the activities going. So there's a trust factor there. So do we have trust with them? Apparently we do, on the economic side, on the trade side. But you can't trust that information. And it depends on actually your business also and what sector. So does the DoD use those devices or not? Or is it just the public sector outside of the DoD, maybe in state and local municipalities? Or is the private sector using it? Of course, the budget comes into play. How do you address that? Probably have to monitor for any CNC or any worms or any other things that may come. It's difficult to say. I would probably go for the chip.
Do you feel like this is something where, I've had a theory, an economic theory around this. And being that you're in Georgia Lottery, maybe this is an initiative we can take to Georgia Lottery. So the state of Georgia and many states around the nation have opportunity zones and HUD zones where there's a bunch of tax benefits for different manufacturing, different, in Georgia, that's pretty much all of eastern Georgia. Every county outside of the county that where Savannah is an opportunity zone within Georgia, all the way up to I think Augusta to the north, and as you go south all the way to Statesboro. Those are all opportunity zones. Ton of tax benefits to do business there. The question is, does industry start requiring devices made in the U.S. where you can go into an opportunity zone and create it all U.S. and would that be more trustworthy than maybe something that's coming from China?
It's a little more trustworthy, but you still have to see the schematics and the diagrams, and you still have to see the design layout, and that should be validated by a third party if it's computing devices, because computing devices are now doing what? They're collecting data, or they're used for data transport or data storage. So I think we may have evolved to the point where there has to be a third party validation, no matter where it's built. Because just because it's built here doesn't make it trustworthy. You can still have the same components come in. Okay, right. We'll assemble those same components. We'll assemble them here, but will you make them here? Sure, but with our designs.
Can you make them here?
Sure.
Right. Can you make them here?
But with their designs, right? So let's look at those designs, and if they cross the line, they're saying, you can't see this. Okay, then we're gonna have to go elsewhere.
I mean, when you look at the military, right, I think the deputy director for the NSA was really kind enough to say, listen, a lot of times we take apart the product to the schematics and we start to go through every single chip. Now that's really manual, right? That's time consuming. That's hiring someone to do just that, right? Take every single device you bring in, lift the hood, open the hood.
That is quite a bit. I think they can automate some of that.
You feel like there can be some automation there?
I think there could be some automation. Some of it's still going to have to be manual, but I think it's like you take a chip and you plug it in the little connector there and you run schematics and tests on it. But of course, the test you're running has to validate what you want to validate and has to be current. So you're going to have to update that testing module. But see, you're still taking it apart.
Right.
And how are you going to do that? Random sample? That's the only way to do it. That's how we do with our cargo ships that come in. You never know what people are offloading in the States, but random sampling, that's still a tough call. So it's the 80-20 rule, right?
You bring up a really good point, which is you're almost like you're having to pick your poison in security. You get
reducing the risk because you can't eliminate it.
Right. Reducing it, but then you also know that somewhere, somehow, something is going to happen that you knew was going to happen, that you've been praying it doesn't happen, and then when it does happen, you're like, oh, Lord.
Sitting on borrowed time?
Sitting on borrowed
sometimes
time.
If we're focusing all on those highs or those criticals, and you've amassed tens of thousands of lows, or however many the number may be, like, oh, those are just lows, those are lows. Yeah, low and slow is how to go. When you start aggregating the lows and the mediums, one can actually be used to help another, and you use an aggregate of a couple mediums and lows, and it can be just as bad as a high.
That's a really good kind of thing, because what you're essentially saying is, as a CISO, I know I can never have 100% security. The other part I don't have 100% of is job security, because once an event happens, you're typically the, Alex, and Alex Tan, when he was on the podcast, he said, a CISO is a chief internal scapegoat officer.
Oh, Alex, that's funny.
And I went,
an incident is an RGE, resume generating event.
Right. And after he said that, I went and being the kind of mind I sometimes have, I started looking back at it. And he was absolutely right. In most security breaches, within 30 to 45 days, the CISO steps down, resigns, is fired, whatever the case may be. But one that I've seen, JP Morgan Chase.
I know him.
CISO stayed there post-breach.
Yep.
They recovered quicker. They were able to sustain faster. and the company really, and the CEO was still there, and the CIO was still there, no one really got fired for it. They took that as a learning experience.
Total response. Incident response is not only technical response, but it's political response, it's communication. There's all kinds of responsiveness, and also the preparedness on the front end. Was there due diligence? Was there due care in place already? And then how was the response to all the stakeholders, all the vested people?
But I think even if you're the best, most of the time the knee-jerk reaction is someone has to pay a price. And I think that's the challenge with our corporate culture today. Is, oh, something happened, we lost a sale, we lost an account, someone's got to pay for it, right? Instead of looking at it as an opportunity to build. And that's a challenge for a CISO. I think that's one of those where, when you have an event, you're like, okay, while I'm handling this event, I might as well just start polishing my resume, letting people know I'm interviewing for something before this gets public, so that, I save my tail. And that's really unfortunate.
It is, but I think if you're prepared well, and if you have that vested interest in the protected success of your organization, you're going to be prepared. You're going to handle it properly. You're going to communicate and respond properly. And if things come down that way, then things come down that way. That could be an environmental, it could be a cultural, or it could be due.
You always, whenever you and I talk, you talk about the CIS top 20. And you go, this is my start. This should be everyone's starting point for security. For those listening or watching us now who are just kind of getting their feet wet with security, why start with the CIS top 20?
Well, it gives you a general direction on which way to travel. So instead of coming into a seat in a chair, it's like, okay, now what do I do? Do I read the previous manuals? Where do I go? It's like, well, in information security, you want to protect the information assets against, CIA confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information assets. Well, how do I start doing that? Information assets. Well, what are your assets? Well, you have to know what your assets are. In the CIS top 20, the first 6 are your basics. And that is know what you have so you can protect it. Once you have something and you know what you have identified what you have, well, who needs it? So only certain people should have access to those assets. At what level? Full administrator, super user, just user, power user, there's various levels, and adjust those. Now, are the security elements on those assets the latest and greatest? Are they current or up to date? And after you have that, so you have people that have access to these assets that have been inventoried, as they're working through them, conduct periodic reviews or assessments against those assets to ensure that they are up to date, current, and not conflicting with any security controls or any operational intentions that you have for those assets. And that's a good way to start. That's foundation. Because no matter what does happen, if something should happen to an organization, if you have that solidified or pretty much bolstered, then should you fall down to an area, that's a great place to fall down to. It's a good foundation. If you're building on the second floor, but your first floor or your basement has cracks in the beams and in the corner joists or in the corner post, then you're going to have issues. When the second floor comes down, your bottom's going to go out too.
I love hearing you say that because you're so focused on the basics that I think a lot of people tend to ignore, tend to not pay as much attention to because they're boring, because the basics aren't sexy. Right? It's not the latest, greatest dashboard. It's not the, all the different maps, all the different cool maps or attack vectors that you see on different vendor stuff. It's really just being in the trenches and digging the right trench and setting the right maze in place so that you're able to secure your organization.
And that's something we do as practitioners and professionals on the back end. So on the front end, we can put up those good-looking dashboards and something that everybody else can identify with. And as I talk about basics in InfoSec, we got to think about basics of humanity too, because you have to establish a relationship. And then you can turn the culture through communications in that relationship. It's one thing to have your hands on the rudder trying to turn the ship towards security, But if you have a relationship with everybody in the business units across the board as a team player, not I'm doing my thing and you're doing your thing next to me, but we're actually working together for the betterment of the organization and its progressive growth, then when you turn around on that rudder, you'll see that you have a lot more hands on that rudder and you don't have to push as hard. You're all pushing and turning that rudder.
So you bring up an organizational kind of question here, which is being a team player in security. And I think security today in a lot of organizations kind of has the rep of the IT guy in the 90s and in the 2000s. I mean, I remember when the IT person, when I worked at Verizon Wireless, I was at our corporate office in post-deployment in 05, 06. When the IT person would show up, you'd be like, oh, there we go now. There goes efficiency, there goes productivity. Anytime there was a system update, anytime they did something new, it was always just a pain in the tail. And security folks have that same rep today in a company. Almost.
Similar to audit. Right. 15, 20 years ago, audit walked in and people were like, oh, I know what I do at my job. What are you doing here? Finally, we're at the point in corporate America where audit walks in and like, okay, what can I do for you? What do you need from me?
Right, let's get this
finally
over
got
with.
it. Now it's Infosec's time. We come in and they're like, all right, what did I do wrong? What did I click on? What am I not supposed to plug into my computer or download or et cetera? So I think the mentality is like, people talk about the organization or department of no, it's actually the department of secure. How do we do that? Well, you have to understand what each business group does and how they contribute to the overall organizational goals. And if you can understand that from a security standpoint, and then you can communicate with that individual or the individual business group from their standpoint and how they're looking at their strategic goals, then you come alongside and co-certify their product as a team. They do their finance thing, their HR thing, their corporate affairs, legal thing, their IT thing, their software development thing, and they're bolstered because we come alongside as a security element for what they're working on.
If people understood security to be a business driver rather than a business like a business interference kind of tool, people would adapt it quicker. And the most successful CISOs are the ones like yourself who are more about how do I come and build a consensus and a team around it rather than just sit there and be like, you can't do this, don't plug this, don't do this, rather than don't. Let's, instead of saying no, yes, but.
Right. I think building and keeping relationships are very important. You do that with individuals, with the professionals, and you start focusing on the business goals of the organization, and you're coming alongside to co-certify that product. I think everybody, for that point, will start embracing security as part of or have it innate to how they operate. And they won't look at security as, we got to add them because they got to add controls. And in fact, come to the point where people say, hey, we need Infosec in here to make sure what we're doing is proper and appropriate. So it's not like we do a scan, we found some highs, all of a sudden fix the highs. We found the highs, but that's raw. Let us review it as it pertains to our architecture and our organization and our goals to see if we can put in compensating controls or balance those properly.
So one of my final questions to you. What are your predictions for cyber? We're summer, halfway through 2019. Still a lot of time left in 2019, and we haven't hit cyber high season yet. Christmas isn't here yet. Typically, that fourth quarter tends to be a very, busy fourth quarter.
Yes, it does.
What are some of your predictions in terms of technology, in terms of are we going to see the granddaddy, smack daddy cyber attack that kind of brings everyone into the
no. So
Chinese wood.
It's listening, right? Well, I think on the technology side, I think we may end up, and I hope that we will stop chasing individual threats with individual solutions. I think we're going to go down to a basic method of securing how data is transported, how data is looked at, classified? How is it segmented? I think we're going to stop chasing so many individual. There's a threat. Chase it. Here's a solution. Throw that, and then because we end up as CISOs going, okay, now I have all these solutions potentially that I want to bring on, but how do I know they can play well together amongst themselves, let alone our organizational architecture? So to prevent that from occurring, I think they're going to stop throwing so many solutions at so many individual threats and start being more holistic on how security is applied in a technological manner.
You bring up a good point, because you're starting to see the industry consolidate on the vendor side. The big companies are buying a lot of the smaller kind of standalone products and adding them into a larger product suite. It feels like we're heading towards, I like to call it the top 15.
A blend of solutions with minimal overhead or less overhead than combining all those individual solutions.
And having to manage them. Because when you buy a solution, I mean, you buy a firewall. It's not bought it, install it, done. You got to have people that manage it, that are, going through it, examining it, responding to anything that happens. It's not just I bought it, I'm done. It's I bought it, now I got to train people also to manage the product.
I think there will be a consolidation and a blending of solutions, and we'll come up to have just an AT&T and a Verizon and a Sprint. I think we're going to have like just 4 or 5 top names. Have some outliers, of course, but there'll be some.
I call it the top 15.
Top 15.
And I do it in batches of 5. Because security isn't just holistic, right? You can't have a Verizon for all. I think there's enterprise, there's small business, there's home security. And you're going to see different players go to every single one of those segments. So when you think of enterprise, I'm looking at Amazon, AT&T, Palo Alto, right. Checkpoint, Google. Those guys are starting to buy up. They're starting to get it. When you look at small business, I also look at AT&T. Verizon, CenturyLink. You're seeing all of a sudden those names pop in at RSA with a 40 by 40 booth, and you're like, what are you here for? They're there to let everyone know they're getting into the cyber game. And then they've got teams out there talking to all of these small startups going, how can we go into our small business of 20 computers that's
at your level and be efficient and cost efficient as well?
Right, because I can go and buy that company or buy equity in that company, batch it on, and go to a small business and be like, all right, we're going to be your MSSP. And that's what AT&T did with Alien Vault. I mean, that's when you hear them talk about AT&T cybersecurity now, in 3-4 years from now, they're going to have a bunch of small businesses run through AT&T Cyber. You're going to leave Comcast and go to AT&T Cyber as AT&T Small Business Solutions, because they're going to give you a level of security that's going to be a standard requested by enterprise businesses within your supply chain. For a fraction of the cost of you going and spending $100,000
right
to do it, you're probably going to pay them, maybe $500 a month, because they don't care. They've got billions and billions of dollars, and they can afford to build this out over the long term, because it's going to give them greater market share and greater dominance. And home security, same thing. You're going to start to see that.
That's going to have to come with a lot of awareness.
Right. But you'll start to see secure routers, firewalls. Right, SonicWall is going to start selling routers that are going to have a pre-built firewall with such an easy UI, with a YouTube explainer video.
Right.
That you go to Best Buy or Amazon, you order it, you come home, you turn on that YouTube video, and you install it, watching that YouTube video in 15 minutes. You talked about the next generation of firewalls, the next generation of firewall and routers that you install in your house.
All one device.
Right. That the company, like someone like yourself, Vladimir, when that device comes out, you're going to go to all your executives and be like, you're buying this. And you're installing it in your home. And we're going to create separate networks.
Yep. Absolutely.
Because it increases posture.
So that's the technology side.
That's the technology side. Human side.
I think on the human side, we're going to have some legislation. Finally hold some people accountable, some entities accountable that we don't even know the names of, that data warehouses, data mining, data processing. Say, you can continue doing your business, but I think it's I think they should know that you're actually mining and warehousing their medical information. That you don't just put it in a fine print on the third page when you go to your doctor visit and you sign, I have received a copy of the terms and conditions, and you actually don't ask for it. Because nobody does. And when you do, they're shocked. So instead of hiding that on the third page in small print, something's got to change with that. And maybe be on the first page.
The biggest data broker in the world is a company called the CISM, ACXIOM. And for those listening or watching, if you go to our CyberHub Engage social media, we have a chart of the amount of data they collect on you. They have 23,000 servers processing data. 23,000 servers.
That's
processing
crazy.
Data.
And selling it. Buying, selling.
Well, they're buying. They're building
dossiers, did you
dossiers,
say?
Yep. And then they're selling it.
Profiles. Categorizing the profiles.
From Russia. I'd call them up through a proxy company in Delaware, which I can open online for under $100.
Or bounce it through a Tor or private VPN.
Just open a basic LLC. You can open a foreign-owned LLC in the U.S. No one asks you a question. I've got election data.
So when we validate in information security areas, and we validate and revalidate to check the efficacy of our controls and our administrative processes, how often do we do that at the government level for compliance and for such legislation as privacy?
Well, you read the headline this week, right? Customs and Border Protection had a subcontractor who subcontracted a part of his contract with CBB that had the data of license plate and facial recognition.
So who reviews the contracts, and do the contracts have to include mandatorily that the assurance that the contractor provides extends to all their subcontract or from all their subcontractors?
Well, technically on a government level, if you're subcontracting, you have to list it on your contract.
But does the assurance level cover the subcontractors? No, that's just if I did it. If my subcontractor did it, as far as disclosure.
I think that subcontractor is going to go on a blacklist of government subcontractors. And all you need, all it takes is one government agency to put you on that blacklist, and you don't get a contract.
Okay, so you dissolve the business, rename the business to something else.
The executives are blacklisted. Can't have the same CEO.
Okay.
Can't have the same CEO. Can't have the same address. The government's actually good at that piece. Once you're blacklisted as a contractor, they're very good at that piece.
How hard is it to be blacklisted, though?
How hard is it?
Yeah.
It takes a screw up like this one to get blacklisted. In DOD, it doesn't even take an event to get blacklisted. I will say this for the federal government. With all the different enforcements that they've put in place.
Red tape, bureaucracy.
I would say 2 years ago, before this administration, it didn't have the same level of urgency. This administration came in, and first with Secretary Mattis at DOD, and now with what's going on with DHS and other agencies, cyber's no laughing matter. And think of the orders. President Trump took the gloves off for those agencies and took the gloves off and let the world know, hey, if you're coming at us, we're coming right back at you.
I noticed that for the past 2 years, cyber has been a serious initiative.
And CISA just got, I think, yesterday the Appropriation Committee gave him an extra $400 million above what they requested to fund CISA. $406 million more to fund CISA, above what they had requested in the budget. So I will tell you though a funny thing. At my synagogue, after what happened in the Chabad in Payway, we had DHS come to give us an active shooter training one evening. And the person from DHS that came was from CISA. And so I'm looking at that gentleman and I go, aren't you cyber? Because he said CISA, and I'm like, okay, why is CISA here on active shooter? He goes, that's part of our responsibilities as well.
Because it's infrastructure.
Yep.
Cybersecurity, infrastructure, security.
Agency.
That's interesting. Wow. Physical security.
Yeah. Physical security applies to cyber. I mean, one of the...
Well, it's part of CISSP training also.
Right.
In ISC Square.
Have you been to the new CODA building? The new data bank building?
I'm not.
All right. I'll make sure to invite you. We're going to do a meetup there in August. But when you enter the building, as you're entering the facility, when you go through the doors, it weighs you. So when you're leaving...
Tolerances, right.
When you're leaving, it's comparing that weight. Now,
within certain tolerances, right.
Right, but if you know...
You're like 12 pounds heavier, it's like, hey, or
right.
lighter.
12 pounds lighter, 12 pounds heavier, you know...
Payloads.
Yeah. Let's check you out. What did you bring in with you? What are you taking out with you?
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, that's a great... Their CISO, Mark, is a data bank. He's a brilliant person when it comes to data security. I mean, think about it. He's got to do FedRAMP and data banks. Just having spent some time with Mark and learning his mind behind data center security, and you know the amount of data that flows in and out of their different facilities, you learn to appreciate the role of a CISO at a data center.
I could only imagine. I remember those times with you have to deal from the environment to environment threshold changes within a certain threshold, whether it's exponential or if it's just menial, all kinds of protections as well, resiliency, on-site, off-site, warm sites or hot sites, personnel as well, evacuation.
Yeah. Where it's uncanny simply because most data centers hide in the suburbs, gated. This data center, the new one that they just built, is in the heart of Midtown Atlanta, on the Georgia Tech campus.
Okay.
Across the street from the NCR building. You're like, wow. First of its kind in the country.
Looking forward to seeing it.
It'll be a blast. And Micah and I took a tour there before they installed anything. And it was just...
like a super warehouse.
It was fascinating to enter the place. It was really fascinating to enter the facility because it was still under construction. It wasn't done yet. But it was very fascinating. It was a very interesting... I've been to a lot of data centers. Never one like that.
New emerging technologies.
New emerging technologies, the way they're building it out.
Approaches,
the approach to
right?
it, the green approach to it in terms of energy savings, in terms of backup. There's a lot of perks to it. Vladimir, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
We could keep going. I mean,
I know, right?
We could just keep going, but we want to be respectful of time. So just want to say thanks for being here. If you're listening or watching, thanks so much for being on the show today. Make sure you subscribe and follow us. This episode, if you're listening, will be available on YouTube as well. Thanks to our sponsors. Thanks to Vladimir. You can also follow them there. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back. Next week, I will be in Israel. We'll be broadcasting some of our episodes with the CISO delegation that I have coming with me to Israel. Our Hebrew episodes will be turned up. We'll have a ton of those coming your way as well. So if you're like to listen to us in Hebrew, you'll have that. We'll also have a few in Arabic, and we will have none in Russian. I'm sorry, Vladimir.
Quite all right.
Although when Nir and I get together, we do a little bit of Russian.
Right.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit, right? Ukrainian.
In his Ukrainian, yeah. His Ukrainian, which is technically Russian because it comes from the part of Ukraine where they are very much Belaruski and not Ukrainian. But that's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe and follow us. And follow me on Twitter, James_Azar1, for live updates of my trip and the Tel Aviv Cyber Week. When I'll be in Israel, we'll be visiting some really cool facilities. Some of them I can't take pictures, but I'll share us entering the facilities and so forth. So if you're not following me on Twitter, make sure you do so now. That's it for this time. We'll be back next week.